There was once a time when parapsychologists in the United States and Russia planned to work together on joint remote viewing projects. Keep watching this channel to learn more about it. You can now download a free PDF copy of issue number 8 of the New Thinking Aloud magazine, or order a beautiful printed copy. Go to newthinkingaloud.org. New Thinking Aloud is presented by the California Institute for Human Science, a fully accredited university offering distant learning graduate degrees that focus on mind, body, and spirit. The topics that we cover here. We are particularly excited to announce new degrees emphasizing parapsychology and the paranormal. Visit their website at cihs.edu.
Book 3 in the New Thinking Aloud dialogue series is UFOs and UAP, Are We Really Alone? Now available on Amazon.
Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. We'll be exploring parapsychology in Russia today with my guest Loyd Auerbach, who is the co-author with Ed May, Joe McMoneagle, and Victor Rubel of the book ESP Wars, East and West. Loyd has written many other books on parapsychological topics, including Mind Over Matter, ESP, Hauntings and Poltergeists, and Reincarnation, Channeling, and Possession. He's on the board of advisors of the Rhine Research Center in Durham, North Carolina, where he also teaches an online parapsychology course. He holds a master's degree in parapsychology from John F. Kennedy University. And now we'll switch over to the internet video. Welcome, Loyd. It's a pleasure to be with you once again.
Thank you, Jeffrey. It's good to be with you again as well.
ESP Wars. I mean, it's largely focused on Cold War parapsychology, but there's a lot of very interesting material subsequent to the Cold War, and it certainly left me with the impression that there's probably an amount of parapsychology going on even right now inside of Russia.
But, I just had lunch with the main author, Ed May, who you know, who, of course, was the program director of Stargate, our Stargate program for over 10 years. And we had lunch yesterday, and he mentioned that when we're talking about acceptance of psychic ability here in the States, he said it's already been done in Russia. They all accept it anyway, culturally. So we have a big cultural difference between the U.S. and Russia, and certainly what the Soviet Union was.
It is accepted there in the sense that they have an ancient shamanistic tradition, which is sort of in the bones and in the blood of the Russian people. Yet I know there's a lot of pushback, and I'm under the impression that it's probably not the case that there's major government funding going on in Russia right now.
I don't believe there's a huge amount, certainly not what was going on during the Cold War. There were 40 institutions during the Cold War that were doing parapsychology research under the Soviet government. And there's not as much, but there still is some going on, and certainly some more applied things with remote viewing over there.
And I get the impression that it often requires a very strong personality with good credentials in the conventional sciences and a respected academic position. And if such an individual wishes to engage in parapsychology research, they're likely to be able to direct some funds for that purpose.
That seems to be the case today. It certainly was the case during the Soviet Union. Of course, they had a directive to come up with, I guess you could say, countermeasures to what they thought we were actually doing, because there was thought in the early 60s that the U.S. was doing research on telepathy and other areas of psychic experience that seems to have been based on perhaps an experiment that didn't succeed. if it actually ever happened, and a leak from the CIA. There was a submarine experiment, supposedly, where they were testing to see whether or not they could communicate telepathically from deep sea within a sub to the surface. And that didn't really work. But it was leaked apparently to the Soviets, and the Soviets took it and felt compelled to do their own version of research, which sent them on a path spending billions of dollars in all these institutions, which of course led to us starting the Stargate program as it was originally conceived, because we were afraid of what they were doing.
Now, I remember very well, because I'm old enough, back in 1969, when Psychic Discoveries Behind the Iron Curtain was a major bestseller. It was available in virtually every bookstore. I think they sold well over 1 million copies. And it was part of what inspired that very exciting decade of the 1970s, when it seemed as if parapsychology might revolutionize the world, because we were going gung-ho and the Russians were going gung-ho. But subsequently, certainly in this country, the revolution, the psychic revolution that I anticipated back in the 1970s has yet to fully manifest. And I presume things have quieted down in Russia as well.
Yeah, Psychic Discoveries Behind the Iron Curtain is a really interesting book. I remember when it came out as well. I was a young teenager, and I was very interested in parapsychology, so I read it when it came out. It was pretty fascinating, and of course there were subsequent books after that about that. In working on ESP Wars, though, with Ed and Victor Rubel and Joe McMoneagle, and their material that they had, and especially the material that had been gathered in interviews with several of the Russian principals, people who were heavily involved in the Soviet program and the Russian program. One of the most interesting things that came out of what I read and what I played with, the information in these interviews, was that most of what was in Psychic Discoveries Behind the Iron Curtain was essentially propaganda in terms of successes. But it was not propaganda directed at the West. That's the interesting thing. These were researchers and individuals, including people within the KGB and the military, who were basically using success or giving successes to the Kremlin in order to keep their funding going and to stay out of gulags. It just happens that our journalists got caught up in that as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I actually back in the 1970s interviewed Sheila Ostrander and Lynn Schroeder, the authors of that book, when they were out on a book tour, and they did do a good job of journalism, and they translated a lot of material from the Russian. But I can well imagine that the researchers they spoke to, at least to some degree, were out to impress them.
Absolutely. They were out to impress them because they were out to impress the Kremlin.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't the case that they had all these wonderful successes with psychotronic machines, generators and weapons and things. They did not have any success with that at all.
But the interesting thing about this book is that after the 20-year investigation funded by the U.S. military intelligence community came to an end, that's when Ed May, who was one of the principal researchers in that project and for the last 10 years was the principal researcher, traveled to Russia and began to develop really good relationships with the individuals who had been his counterparts. And largely your book is based on his interviews with those people.
Yeah, actually, Ed and Joe McMoneagle started these relationships a little before the program ended. So it was actually around 93 that they started these back and forth discussions. And then he and Joe both went over there. And actually, Victor Rubel, who was one of our authors, was one of the principal interviewers for these Russian sources, which include General Boris Ratnikov and General Alexei Savin. Those are two of our main sources in the book. The foreword of the book is actually written by Nikolai Sham, who was the deputy director of the KGB when the Soviet Union fell. So these were guys who were heavily involved.
So you're getting it really right from the horse's mouth, and not so much the researchers dependent upon funding, but very high-ranking officials who were supervising them.
Supervising them and involved directly. Ratnikov himself was Gorbachev's psychic shield. He had his own psychic experiences. And he was often present with Gorbachev when Gorbachev met with Reagan and people from the U.S. to prevent us from possibly mind controlling Gorbachev.
So this has always been an interest in Russia, is the idea of, I guess it goes back even to the days of Vasiliev back in the 1930s, telepathic hypnotic induction.
Yes. L.L. Vasiliev is a well-known Russian researcher, well-known within parapsychology, who did work on telepathic hypnosis, although didn't have the kind of success that the Russians would have liked. They weren't able to hypnotize people who had not been hypnotized previously. They had to work with post-hypnotic suggestions telepathically sent.
There were a number of stories in the book about people who believed themselves to have come under the influence of telepathic hypnosis. In fact, I recall a fascinating section in the book where there's reference to Russian gangsters employing parapsychology.
There's some really interesting things that came out of the accounts, especially from Boris Ratnikov. I think he, of all the sources, told a lot of funny stories. We left a few of the funny stories actually in the book from Ratnikov. He was a young guy who got into the KGB, and he was a lifelong KGBer. And the way he tells the story, and even what Savin says in the book, our idea of the KGB is very different than what they were talking about being within the KGB. In fact, it seems that within the country, the KGB was like the FBI, and locals were more likely to call the KGB when they were in trouble than they would call the local police, because the local police were corrupt. At least that was the KGB version of that. But they used remote viewing quite a bit, even in the Soviet era and afterwards, for law enforcement. In fact, that was the major application of remote viewing within the Soviet Union, within Russia, was more applied to criminology, to dealing with gangsters who often themselves believed in this experience and might have had their own psychics fighting against the KGB psychics. Mm-hmm.
So, and Ratnikov was one of the principals involved in all of this.
Boris Ratnikov provides a huge amount of background on this whole program and his participation as a psychic, not just as a principal from the military. Again, he was known as the psychic shield for Gorbachev, supposedly psychically shielding him from any mind control attempts, which we never did.
Yeah. Well, and that's quite interesting because there are a number of stories in there where Ratnikov and other psychics are used for that purpose, to act as shields or healers, who are in effect using what I guess you'd have to say some form of psychokinesis. I mean, the idea of psychic shielding like that is not one that I've encountered really in Western parapsychology.
Not for one person to shield another. For a person to shield themselves, perhaps, that's not an uncommon idea. That's a psychic self-defense idea. But yeah, you're right. I had not encountered that as someone shielding someone else previously.
Mm-hmm. And I gather from these reports of Ratnikov that the KGB or other law enforcement agencies may have actually had on their staff or on their payroll maybe as many as 30 psychics working on law enforcement issues.
They had a variety of psychics across the country. Tofik Dadashev was one of the main psychics who is in the book and has been interviewed for the book as well. And he was involved in a number of really interesting legal cases, yeah.
Some of the cases that Dadashev was involved in were very high profile, I gather.
They were, and involved terrorists and other situations where there were hostage takers. And he was certainly one of the better known psychics in the Soviet Union and in Russia.
As I read the chapter on Dadashev, I see that he made the transition from working exclusively for the Russian security services to eventually being able to contract himself out and work for foreign entities.
Well, that happened because the Soviet Union fell, because Russia shifted. I'm not quite sure where that is today, given the current climate that we have with Putin and the others, but there still is, they're still somewhat active there. And it was not just, law enforcement. Of course, the military itself had used psychics as well. Alexei Savin talks about training people. They had a whole training program for remote viewing. And they actually trained military personnel to do remote viewing. even putting individual remote viewers in tanks during the Chechnya conflict so that they could actually tell the tank folks that there was somebody around the corner with an RPG, for example. Ed May's joke about that is, 40 feet is not terribly remote.
But there is this sense of intuitive instinct that when you're in the battlefield itself, sometimes you can feel second by second when dangers are around the corner that are not visible.
And this was actually even more than that. This was actually trying to view who was there and where it was coming from, and whether, not just the instinct of, do we stop here, but what was coming, what's actually around the corner, what's going to happen, but actually what is happening right now. So who is there ready for us to ambush us?
And Savin, I understand, worked very closely with Ed May. The two had proposed to set up a joint Russian-American parapsychology project to be funded by both governments. The proposals were written, never apparently approved, but Savin ran what you describe as probably the largest remote viewing operation in the world, with maybe 100 remote viewers.
He certainly did, and had some of the best remote viewers in the world. Joe McMoneagle got to meet his counterpart, the best viewers over there, in a couple of visits. And it really is interesting. I think it's certainly the culture that allowed for more of an expansion than we certainly had here. Although the success of the Stargate program, I just was given yesterday by Ed the third volume in the Stargate archives. The fourth volume will be out shortly. And there were over 580 individual missions or tasks that were given by a variety of federal agencies. And I love hearing, the skeptics talk about none of it was any good. And yet these agencies consistently came back again and again and again to the Stargate personnel for more intel. And you'd think that if it wasn't successful, they wouldn't keep coming back. So we have a skew of how our culture sees this subject and how our science and academics see it versus what the Russians did, which was very much supportive.
Let me put on the devil's advocate cap for a moment, because I can imagine that, let's say I'm with some government security agency and I've used remote viewing in the past and not had successes, but now I've got a new problem and all of my conventional methods for gathering information are failing. And I might say to myself, well, remote viewing didn't work in the past, but maybe it'll work this time. I'll give it one more try.
Yeah, except that the feedback has been that it was providing useful intel. So that's the thing. The problem a lot of times, though, is specifically they meaning Ed, Joe, and the other viewers didn't necessarily know anything more than you gave us good intel. They didn't know specifically what the intel was, and they also didn't know if the agency acted on the intel. Because there's one thing to provide actionable intelligence, another to actually go out and use that intelligence into the field. And obviously, if you're a government bureaucrat, national intelligence or national security, and you're working on a particular mission or a particular project, or you have a dozen such missions and projects you're working on, providing detailed item by item feedback to the remote viewing units in Fort Meade or at SRI or SAIC is not going to be your highest priority. You've got to prioritize how you use your time, and nobody's paying you to help them in their scientific endeavor. That's correct. Plus, there's the added level of classification. So whether the material or the task itself was classified. Very often they'd be given a task without knowing what location they're supposed to be viewing. So what does it have to do with anything? You need to view this location or say what's going on this particular day in this location. And they can provide what's there, and they can possibly guess at what is being asked, but they're not even told what the actual problem is that they're trying to solve. So if it's a classified issue, they can provide whatever information they can. They can speculate as to what was going on, but they may not get the feedback as to what actually was accurate because what was going on was classified.
Well, I'm under the impression that some of these same issues, in fact, probably many of these same issues also have occurred in Russia, and that due to a lot of the bureaucratic shakeups that took place with the fall of the Soviet Union, a lot of the funding for parapsychology didn't get renewed.
Yeah, those 40 institutions don't really exist anymore. I mean, it dropped down to only a few people like Sabin doing research at this point. There are individuals at a few universities that are still doing research there. We do hear from time to time. But it's certainly not any sort of program like what the Soviets were doing.
One of the big Soviet or Russian emphases was psychotronics, the idea that there was some form of technology, instruments that could be built and developed that would augment psychic functioning, a kind of human-machine interface for the purpose of telepathic hypnotic induction or spying or things of that sort. And I gather one of your informants had literally dozens, if not hundreds, of Russian inventors coming to him with their devices.
Yeah, apparently it wasn't uncommon for these institutions to have people show up with black boxes or other devices saying this will make people psychic or this will be a weapon of the mind. And the receptionist or whoever the researcher was that was doing intake at that point would say, thank you very much, take the device and toss it into a storeroom or closet, because they had been already doing so much testing and knowing that nothing was working, that it wasn't really worth it to them to continue in that vein.
But your book does hint that maybe some of those devices either have been shown to work, or at least they haven't been disproven, they haven't been tested.
Well, I'd say that based on what our informants told us, that the majority of the devices handed to them weren't ever tested. And it's possible that some of them did work. They ended up relying more heavily on people, which is what we have done, of course.
Yeah.
They didn't find that there were necessarily any bits of technology that could enhance psychic ability. And relatively recently, Ed asked Nikolai Sham again, was there anything, did you have any success at all? And he pretty much said no. Not with psychotronics.
Well, our mutual friend Beverly Rubik is currently the president of the U.S. Psychotronics Association. I was a keynote speaker there at their annual event last year, and there was a wide range of radionics devices and crystals and wire coils of different kinds with their inventors there making similar claims. And I talked to a number of people who told me about the incredible successes they had using these devices. So the field of psychotronics is still alive and viable here in the United States. I can say that.
The question I would have is, maybe the individual had, was there more than one individual who had success with this device? Because I could see that an individual who might not understand that they are themselves psychic might actually build a device which does work for them because they believe it works for them. But then the question is, if I hand it off to somebody else, is it going to work for that other person?
Well, I can say this. In the United States, there are companies that are building these devices and marketing them, and they've been in business for years. They have clients who will use them and apparently keep coming back for more. And the people I talked to were not the inventors of the devices. They were people who acquired them, sometimes by accident, sometimes intentionally. And, I did an interview, in fact, with Beverly on psychotronics. I'm going to link to it right now. Our viewers can go to the upper right-hand part of their screen and click into that interview if they're interested. Beverly and I sort of likened it to the idea that if you have a pencil, it's easier to do arithmetic.
That makes sense. For dowsers, and the dowsing ability is, of course, internal. It's not from the stick, but the sticks will make it easier for you to do that.
Now, you mentioned that the Russians did remote viewing, and of course, back in by the mid-1970s, Puthoff and Targ had published Mind Reach. They had published articles about remote viewing in the proceedings of the Electronics Engineering Society. IEEE. So the information about American experimental successes in remote viewing was widely read, and I'm sure the Russians had access to it. Were they modeling their remote viewing on the American approach, or did they have a unique approach?
Generally, from what we got from informants, it may have been a combination of the two things. Clearly, so while the government research was going on, Targ and Puthoff were doing research for the CIA initially, and doing work for them. So all these tasks that these programs, whether it was Sunstroke or Grill Flame or Stargate, all the various names of these projects, at the same time that those were going on, the same researchers, including Ed May. I mean, I remember Ed May doing a presentation on remote viewing for the Parapsychological Association during the middle of all this. In fact, I visited him at SRI before he left SRI to go over to SAIC, and not once did he say he was doing research for the government. That was the thing that was secret. So they were taking the application of remote viewing and what they were learning, and they were testing it in a way that could actually go out so that others could replicate it. At the same time, they were doing all these tasks that were classified or doing work for the government, for various agencies in the government. So it was kind of available. The methodologies were available to the public and available certainly to the Russians at that time. Not the specific task, or even that we were doing it covertly as well.
It would seem as if some of the Russian remote viewers were extremely talented, according to the reports of Joe McMoneagle and Ed May, who had a chance to engage in some joint experiments with them.
Some people have an aptitude for it, and that's a word that Ed's used, and I've used certainly. There's an aptitude for doing remote viewing. Although Ed and Joe were convinced that you could only get so good, and then you can't get any better than that. So you have to figure out what the high level of your aptitude. So finding the people who could do remote viewing as good as a Joe McMoneagle, not always easy, but the Russians had a few people like that.
Yeah. I gather that one of the things the Russians did is they conducted some mass experiments to see what percentage of the population were capable of performing remote viewing at a professional level.
Yeah, I'm not sure if they did it with that specific task
criterion,
in mind, but they certainly did testing of a lot of people.
Your book reports that, as I recall, they claim roughly 1.5% of the population could be good remote viewers.
Right, that's right. Yeah, and you know that number probably also would be the same here in the States if we were to take the time and take a look at that.
Ed May, I think, claimed that the general measurements of the population seem similar.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, the big difference being mainly cultural more than anything else. But as you know, belief does influence psychic ability in the sense of incidence and actually the form it actually can take as well.
Yeah. Now, and of course, the Russian people having kind of a mystical bent, I think it's in the Russian soul, you might say. One finds it in Russian literature and in Russian history. I recall one of the researchers being interviewed in your book said they weren't interested in working with people who just show up and say, "Hey, I'm a great psychic."
I think that that's the case here as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, because we've certainly had that happen in various laboratories. So, no, they were not interested in just the people that kind of came off the street and showed up, just like they weren't necessarily interested in the specific psychotronic devices that didn't seem to be working. So they took a little bit more care in terms of who they were going to test and who they were going to work with. And Savin and the others worked with people in the military because they wanted to keep it close to the vest, more or less.
Now, Savin, I gather, is now retired.
He is. He's still doing remote viewing research from what Ed tells me.
He's no longer the head of a big institute with 100 remote viewers working for him.
And Boris Radikoff is essentially retired as well.
So the people who were active 20 years ago are, for the most part, retired at this point. Retired
from their military positions, still dabbling in the subject, just like Ed and Joe have been dabbling in the subject.
Yeah.
So do you ever really retire in this field?
Well, I suppose I'm not retired either. But now another aspect of parapsychology in the Soviet Union is healing. And, of course, there are several really famous healers that have come out of Russia. Juna Devashtashvili has been mentioned in your book prominently, and as I recall, she also worked many years ago and engaged in a long-distance remote viewing experiment when Russell Targ went over there with his daughter Elizabeth.
Right. Yeah, I mean, the healing tradition is part of the shamanic tradition of Russia, of those countries, in fact, of Eastern Europe. And the thing, that's often different, certainly, than remote viewing. It doesn't have the same application for military use or for espionage, but it certainly can be useful, as we know. Healing is an incredibly useful task and technique. We don't have as much information from those sources, though, about the healers as the other programs that they were actually doing, unfortunately. But fortunately, there is still healing research going on over there, as well as pretty much everywhere else in the world.
When highly placed people at the very top of the government or major institutions, if they get sick, they may call on a healer to come and work with them publicly. I don't think that's very rare in the United States for high-profile people to do that.
Well, there'd be so much crap coming from skeptics and other people about anyone high-profile asking for alternative healing in any way, shape, or form, something other than traditional, what we consider traditional Western medicine today. And people have done that. People have. Celebrities have gone to healers, and they get raked over the coals for it, even if they have successes in those circumstances. So it's a cultural thing. There's no question it's a cultural thing.
The lady I mentioned, Juna Devashtashvili, for example, was involved in a very high-profile healing, as I recall.
Yeah. The cultural, my background's in anthropology, my undergraduate background's in anthropology, and I've taught courses in anthropology and parapsychology over the years. And looking at Western culture and pop culture, especially, and how that influences Western culture versus traditions that still are extant in Eastern Europe and Russia and China and places like that, we have, I guess, moved further away from tradition, which is both good and bad at the same time. We ignore things that have become pharmaceuticals, and a lot of the pharmaceuticals we have, we're starting out as root medicine or some other kind of shamanic or magical remedy, which actually was not magical at all. The ritual was magical, but the remedy itself was not. Because it's easier to take a pill than to actually have a powder or poultice or something else. Plus, they can make more money at it. Yeah. So when you look at different cultures, whether it's healing or any application of psychic experience, the way that psi manifests in that culture and tradition and how tradition has stuck with it is going to influence what we hear about and the practice of these folks. You have a lot more healer practitioners in places where healing is accepted. Here we have people just being put upon if they start saying they can heal.
Maybe this is the same because your co-author and our mutual friend Ed May would consider himself a physicalist. He's not one of these parapsychologists who think that we have to develop a whole new metaphysics in order to explain psychic functioning. He believes that eventually modern Western materialism is going to resolve the mystery of how psychic functioning works. And I gather that in Russia and the former Soviet Union as well, there's still a lot of that. People talking about bioplasmic energies and new forms of energies, and that eventually they hope to have physical models to explain these things.
Well, and I think that if you expand our physical understanding of the universe, you will have physical models to understand these things to some extent. The big question is whether we have a full understanding of what consciousness is down the road. That's actually a big question in science. In having discussion with that, because I'm not a physicalist, I'm not a materialist in that way. I do believe in life after death. I think there's some great evidence for the survival of consciousness and consciousness existing or extending past the body. I just don't think that we have the ability right now, or the technology or the understanding in science to explain these things. I do think we'll gain that over if we survive the next 50 or 100 years, of course, we'll have that ability to expand our understanding of these things if we study it. I mean, the problem is that in most parts of the world, it's taboo still to actually put money to study the scientific study of these things. And until even the other side, the people who are skeptics, there are millions of people who have psychic experiences. This is not explainable. I mean, the fact that, and this is a fact, that skeptics, people who call themselves skeptics, often say it doesn't exist, these things don't happen, and they have no explanation other than kind of lip service, because they will not look at the individual studies, or they will not look at the evidence that's actually there and try to come up with an explanation. But even within our field, as you know, we have different attitudes and explanations for things like apparitions versus it's ESP, it's the ESP of the living.
Right.
So we have to kind of still research these things to get an understanding of them.
Would you say that the climate in Russia today is different, that people don't laugh as much, the giggle factor, or what I sometimes call the horse laugh factor, doesn't inhibit research in Russia as much as it seems to be an active inhibitor here?
I would say that is the case, but I think that goes back even to the Soviet Union. I think that really, because there was support within that milieu, it has continued. It doesn't grow out of nothing. It actually was there. Mm-hmm. And what's really interesting to me is I've talked to some Chinese researchers, so you have the Chinese government, if you suggest that it's psi or ESP or PK or Qi even, they might shut down a researcher. I've talked to researchers who have to be very, very careful when they're doing studies around this subject on how they explain what's going on or how they speculate what's going on. That really didn't happen in the Soviet Union. And one thing that actually Ed educated me about this, and then I since did some research on this, we always talked about, thanks to the FBI in the 1950s, them being godless communists. Right. And yet Stalin went to church. They weren't godless at all. They were never godless. They just they really separated church and state further than perhaps we have.
And they'd think of us as godless capitalists.
Well, they probably have more evidence than we do of them being godless.
Yeah. But on the other hand, now I know parapsychology barely has a foothold at all in the United States. I got a doctoral degree, a doctoral diploma that says parapsychology nearly 40 years ago, and it's still, the only one.
Yeah, and I have a master's in parapsychology. I'm one of a very handful of a few, so yeah.
So, but there is the Journal of Parapsychology and a few other journals that routinely publish articles. Do they have journals in Russia now? Do you know?
There are, as far as I know, there are still some scientific journals over there that are being published, and are certainly articles in other journals. And my understanding is that they have a little bit more freer reign of getting articles published, for example, in a physics journal or the equivalent of a psychology journal over there than we certainly do here. When mm-hmm. somebody publishes something related to psi in a psychology journal, all of a sudden the world is in an uproar. The scientific world is upset with the journal and upset with everybody. And those same scientists who are so upset because psi doesn't exist will not even look at the paper. Mm-hmm. They'll just comment on it before it even comes out.
Yeah. I mean, I know that last summer, the American Psychological Association published a review of the parapsychology literature in their flagship journal, the American Psychologist. It was a very favorable review. And then I interviewed James Alcock, a very well thought of and prominent skeptic of parapsychology. And his attitude is that, well, it just goes to show you the American Psychological Association can no longer be trusted.
It's this really weird attitude, but it's a bias. It's a total bias. They're true disbelievers, not skeptics, just like we have true believers who accept everything.
The overall impression I had from your book is that things are relatively similar here as in the Soviet Union.
They are, like I said, if you have, at no time in the United States do we ever have 40 institutions doing research on parapsychology. We might have had 40 researchers at various institutions, but not 40 labs, not 40 concerted efforts that were actually going on. So they've always had an edge. They certainly spent a lot more money than we did on the subject over time. The entire military program that we had was a little over $22 million in 22 years, which is next to nothing. They spent more than that on toilets in the Pentagon.
But now you're referring to the Soviet Union era.
Right. Not as much money now. I mean, they're still spending some, but we really don't have necessarily the same idea, the same information. Of course, we didn't have that during the Soviet era. We got that after the fact. But there's still research going on there, and it's not as much perhaps sponsored by the government.
Well, I know if I were to show up at the annual convention of the Parapsychological Association, which this year I believe is in Paris, there will be researchers from China. There will be researchers from Latin America. I'm not aware of any expectation of researchers from Russia or Eastern Europe. Do you have any sense of that?
I do not know if anyone is coming from any of those countries. I know that there have been people in Hungary who have shown up in the past, and a couple of other Eastern European countries. I'm not quite sure about Russian researchers.
Loyd, this has been a fascinating discussion. It sort of leaves me frustrated because my sense is, even after reading your book, that there were many, many anecdotes and stories, but maybe it's a translation issue. I don't get the sense that there are a lot of technical papers available for readers, especially in the English language, translated coming out of Russia.
I don't believe that there are today either. There are certainly Russian sources online, from what I understand, that are being published in Russian, but we don't have a lot that's been translated. I believe Larissa Vilenskaya actually translated some material over the years from the Soviets, but today we don't really have that kind of information. And I will say that there were a few stories, as I mentioned earlier before we started this, that I left out of the book that had been part of what we were given by the Russians in their interviews, because they had more to do with, they were non-Psi related. There were a couple stories about UFOs and a couple of just some other silly stories about the KGB, which we did leave out, which should go into another book actually altogether.
These days we have, at least here in the United States, the attitude often in the media that Russian has become once again mostly a real dictatorship, that Putin calls the shots. And do you have any sense at all of his attitude towards parapsychology?
I don't, because actually Ed has been over there, and our book was released in Russian, so he was over there for the book release, but not really a sense of Putin himself and what he was thinking of the subject. Certainly there's people in the government who were very interested over there who did show up at the book release, but as far as I know, I don't know of any situation where Putin has expressed his interest.
Or any other sense of an official policy from the Russian government?
There doesn't, from what I understand from Savin and Ratnikoff, there's no official policy, certainly not an official policy against it. It doesn't have that giggle factor, because the giggle factor in politics is what prevented continued funding in our field. And in even that joint Russian-U.S. project that Ed and Savin tried to put forth, it just didn't go anywhere because there was no interest, thanks to that giggle factor here in politics.
And so my sense is that probably in both countries and elsewhere in the world, the best prospects for parapsychology are to operate under some different rubric, to publish studies in biology and chemistry and physics and other well-accepted sciences that have perhaps a parapsychological element, and kind of weave it into mainstream thinking that way.
I think that is the best plan that we could possibly come up with, partly because parapsychology as a subject is so put upon, especially by academia in the West. I think that worming our way into these other journals and finding people who are in academia, in the sciences, who are expressing interest and will start doing research on their own. Because what we really need is, yes, we need funding for our field, but what we really need is people from other fields starting to act on their interest in the subject and how it relates to their own field. That's what we really need. Unfortunately, especially in the West, the attitudes in academia which has been engendered by the skeptics organizations more than anything else, is that if you have an interest in this, you're nuts, you're not credible, it's all woo-woo, it's all crazy stuff, so you should stay away from the subject.
Yeah. Well, once again, Loyd Auerbach, this has been an informative and I would say eye-opening interview. So thank you for being with me.
Thank you, Jeffrey.
It's been a pleasure.
Book 3 in the new Thinking Aloud dialogue series is UFOs and UAP, Are We Really Alone? Now available on Amazon.
New Thinking Aloud is presented by the California Institute for Human Science, a fully accredited university offering distant learning graduate degrees that focus on mind, body, and spirit. The topics that we cover here. We are particularly excited to announce new degrees emphasizing parapsychology and the paranormal. Visit their website at cihs.edu. You can now download a free PDF copy of issue number 8 of the New Thinking Aloud magazine or order a beautiful printed copy. Go to newthinkingaloud.org.